The following is a Bergen-Fischer media production.
Hey guys, you're listening to the In the Blood podcast. I am your host, AC Bergen-Fischer. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen, whether you are a new or returning listener. I'd like to invite you to consider what is being shared with an open mind and a receptive heart. Before we begin, though, the following disclaimer. I am a coach, not a therapist. Everything I share is opinion-based and from personal experience. If you require therapy, I'd be happy to help you explore your options. For those who would prefer coaching with me, that could be arranged via email at inthebloodpod@gmail.com. Finally, if you'd like to support this project for as little as $5, you can do so by visiting buymeacoffee.com/inthebloodpod.
Dear Mr. Vernon, we accept the fact that we had to sacrifice a whole Saturday in detention for whatever it was we did wrong. What we did was wrong, but we think you're crazy for making us write an essay telling you who we think we are. What do you care? You see us as you want to see us. In the simplest terms, the most convenient definitions, you see us as a brain, an athlete, a basket case, a princess, and a criminal, correct? That's the way we saw each other at 7 o'clock this morning. We were brainwashed. I remember watching The Breakfast Club sometime in the 80s and thinking how this perfectly summed up who I was at the time. At 16 years old, I was constantly wrestling with the question of who I was. Partially because I was beginning to wonder, but mostly because I was so frequently asked by authority figures seeking to knock me down a few pegs. When I watched the movie recently, I was struck by a couple of things. First, the idea of which parts made up a teenager in the 80s still seemed to hold true, even in retrospect. Second, as complex as being a teenager seemed when I was one, I realized that being a man in his 50s is a little bit more complicated. Of course, I still wrestle with the question of who I am. I'm also confronted by people demanding to know who I think I am on a fairly regular basis. I can't say for sure what's driving them, but their motivations don't usually seem to be very productive. I'm realizing more and more that being a brain, an athlete, a basket case, a princess, and a criminal are more functions of instinct than anything else. These are qualities which naturally exist within all of us until life starts putting pressure and demands on us. What comes after is where things get really difficult. For me, a lot of the difficulty comes from others attempting to define the entirety of my being based on the part that comes to the surface when they're interacting with me. That's not always a bad thing. At least not on the surface, but it almost always frustrates me because I want to be seen for all of who I am. I had someone ask me years ago how my friends would describe me. I answered, they would say that I'm a great bunch of guys. This seemed to be a bit of a red flag to them, and I've always been confused about why. There are many voices inside of me that make up the whole. And in my experience, that's true of all of us. Some of my voices are those of an advocate, a philosopher, a lover, a poet, a counselor, a nurturer, a cheerleader, a comedian, a diplomat, a politician, an analyst, a doctor, and more. Depending on how I'm stimulated or what I'm dealing with, one or more of these voices will make himself heard. And that's usually a good thing. As good as these voices are, none of them represent my all, And I hate to be defined by any one of them. It happens though. When it does, I get more than a little frustrated because there's so much more to me. Not only that, but I don't want to struggle under the weight of any one of these for too long. Best case scenario, someone hearing only one of my voices while ignoring the rest kind of sucks. Best case scenario. You can imagine then how much more frustrating, hurtful, demeaning, unfair, or whatever it is when someone is fixated on one of my other voices. The jerk, the warrior, the critic, the trauma response, the victim, the one who wants to give up, the emotional vampire. All of these are just as much a part of me as the others. I value them because they're all part of what makes me, me. While I value these less wonderful voices, I especially do not want to be defined by any one of them. They are me, but they are not all of me. Sadly, these are the voices that tend to make the biggest impression. These are the ones that too often are interpreted as the real me who was hiding underneath the surface. What I hate the most is that our society has all of us so trained to lock onto the ugly bits of each other instead of considering the whole. As I was going through the list of my own voices, I'm sure most of you were thinking about your own list. When I talk about how I don't want to have one voice speak for all of me, I'm sure you feel the same way about yourselves. But here's where I get angry with myself. Far too often, I find myself making a case for why I should ignore all of another person's voices except for the one that serves my position. Maybe I ignore some bad voices because I don't want to end a relationship. Maybe I pay extra attention to others because they offer justification for me to pay attention only to what I want. Maybe that's super wrong and super unfair. Not just to the people around me, but to me also. I don't want to feel like I'm constantly being judged based on a single trait or momentary impression. That's what it's like when others overlook the depth of who I am. I believe we all have many sides to us, like being an advocate, a philosopher, a lover, and these voices make up our whole being. Society tends to focus on flaws or negative aspects, disregarding the richness of us as individuals. We should work to avoid painting with such a broad brush because when we do, we miss out on so many beautiful details. I admit that I fall into this trap, sometimes focusing on certain traits of others to suit my own needs. That is something I'm working on though. I'm realizing that we all deserve to be seen for our complete selves, not just me. This week, my friends, reflect on the value of empathy and understanding. Embrace the complexity within yourselves and in others. Look beyond surface judgments and try to appreciate the entirety of each person's story. And until next time, much love.